Welcome to Tales from the Fandom, a podcast that brings a special guest out of the multiverse and straight to you. And now your host, David Ginsburg.
Hey everybody, and welcome to the latest episode of Tales from the Fandom. It is David here to talk to you just for a little bit before we get into our interview today. Just some brief notes and information. The first is that for the month of June, we are dedicating the entire month to women in tabletop gaming. That means every day there will be at least one episode being released focusing on a woman who is playing, running, writing, creating something in the tabletop gaming industry. Whether that's Dungeons & Dragons, Star Wars, Genesis system, or anything else in between, we are going to be having so many episodes, and I just wanted to prepare everybody for that because I know it's a bit of a departure from the standard weekly episodes, and just so that you are not caught unaware as a deluge of episodes swamps the month of June, but it's all for a very great cause, just to highlight women in tabletop gaming. With that being said, we are delaying the Book Trek episodes for the foreseeable future, probably until July at this point, especially for the Kevin Hearn Iron Druid Chronicles that Jaquel and I were working our way through. There's just a lot on my plate, and there's a lot on Jaquel's plate as well, and we haven't been able to coordinate the recording times and the time that it takes to read with everything that's going on. So I just want to let everybody know that the Iron Druid Chronicles Book Trek series is currently on hold. We hope to resume possibly in July. It just depends. But definitely go take a listen to those past episodes and check out some of the other Book Trek episodes that I've had with a few different authors on. We are also coming up on our 2-year anniversary, which is on June 6th, which is smack dab in the Women in Tabletop Gaming Month. I do have a few different ideas for special episodes, and so just look for that in the future, obviously in June, as we hit 2 years. And thank you all for those who have been with us since the beginning and those who have joined us at any point over the time. I really just wanted to say thank you. I'm also doing an actual play podcast called Tales from the Five Nations. It's an Eberron campaign setting using the Savage Worlds rule system, and it's a lot of fun. You can find that at just Tales from the Five Nations. Just search for it in any of your podcast apps, and you will find it. And last but not least, if you would like to support this podcast or the Women in Tabletop Gaming Month, you can do so by joining our Patreon, where for as little as $1 a day, you get early information about who I've recorded with, some updated information, shows super early sometimes before they're released, and a lot of other goodies, as well as if you want to support directly the Women in Tabletop Gaming Month, there's a shirt that's being sold right now where all the proceeds are going to the Urgent Act Fund, which is a great women's charity fund. So definitely check that out. And without further ado, I would love for you to enjoy this episode as my voice is going. So thank you so much. And welcome to another episode of Tales from the Fandom. Today I am joined by someone who I came across just offhand after reading a Wired article about a DM in New York City that is a person that you can actually hire to run your games for you. And I am joined today. Thank you so much, Tim, for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, it's totally totally coincidental because I think you and I had liked each other's stuff or something on Twitter, however the Twitterverse works.
Right.
And before that, I had read this article. I was like, no, there's no way it's that same guy. And it was.
Absolutely. And as I said to you before, there had been a convention that I was running games at. So people were constantly identifying me from the article during the convention or posting on the article. I just ran a game with this guy at a convention. It was great. So it was a lot of a perfectly timed weekend, as it were, for all that to come out. Yeah.
Now, for those who aren't aware, you are I guess I would best best summarize it as you're a person people can hire to actually be the DM for their games.
Yes, I offer professional game mastery, and I say that I can, I'm most typically running D&D for people. I can run all different kinds of RPGs, and I often tell people my service is that if people don't have access to a DM, or they do, they have a group of players and none of them want to be the DM, or they're a little burnt out, or most likely in the case of players who are totally new to the game, who have no experience, and really without having a friend, I say it's really hard sometimes to get that avenue into RPGs. And what I do is mostly for new players, I'm providing that avenue where they don't have someone who is capable of running the game. They can bring me in and I will run the game for their coworkers, friends, whatever. And that's, I would say, well over 90% of what I do is with people with really not much connection to the hobby prior to reaching out and contacting me.
And that's one of the coolest things, because you always hear it from people that I've talked to friends of mine. Everyone wants to play, but no one wants to run the game.
Right.
And then there's the thing of like trying to get people to buy into the game or get them involved in the game, and
the commitment.
Yeah, it's always the joking thing back in college, like, oh, I wish I could DM just like as a job. Ha ha ha.
Yes, yeah.
And now you have actually, you are doing that. You're living the dream of, college kids and people that just want to play games.
Well, I am extremely lucky to have the opportunity that I do. My approach is definitely very much as a teacher. My background is teaching, and actually in games-based teaching. That's my expertise. But I absolutely love bringing people in like this, and I love providing that kind of avenue. And I am one of the luckiest people I know to get to have taken this opportunity and made it my livelihood. I count my blessings every day.
And we're definitely going to, talk tabletop gaming, probably the second half of the podcast. But you and I both share a very unique interest in a comic book taste that I have not talked about, and I'm really excited about. And that is, and I'm going to butcher his last name, but it's Curtis Weeb, I think.
I think so.
And his comic book Rat Queens.
Yes. I absolutely love Rat Queens. It is one of my favorite adaptations of RPGs into another media form that I have ever seen. It's right up there, I think. Probably my favorite adaptation of D&D into like a fantasy comic form out of anything. Just the sense of humor. It does so many things so right. It is wonderful. Go read Rat Queens. It is fantastic.
What was funny for me is I had been told all these comics, because I've been out of comics for years and years. There's a certain time where it's after like that post-college, you got kids, you got the wife, you're not spending the $4 plus change for one comic book.
Sure, right.
And like my friend had recommended like Brian K. Vaughan's Saga. I was like, okay, cool. Yeah. I'll read that. But then I had come across something. I have no clue, maybe a picture on the internet, something, but it was from Rat Queens. I was like, I've got to read this. It looks awesome. I picked it up, and it was not even close to what I was expecting as far as like story, characters, anything like that. It was off the walls, but at the same time, it made me want to play in that world, like a D&D style world like that.
I would, in a heartbeat, jump into the Rat Queens, like very tongue-in-cheek D&D world, if you will. Oh my god! So I was working at a comic book shop at the time when Rat Queens was first coming out. I was at Forbidden Planet in Union Square in New York City, and that was where I started my business. That's where I would once a day, I tell people once a day someone would come in and say, D&D, I always wanted to play that. Oh well, I guess I never will. And then I just started printing up business cards after the 300th time hearing that. So but Rat Queens was coming out. I was heavily pushing Rat Queens along with some of the other girls working at the store we were just huge advocates for Rat Queens. And for my 2 cents, I think that the idea of an adventuring party that just goes out into the woods, does drugs, like does like all these crazy antics, and is not really respected by the town that much. In some ways is the silliest, and in some ways the most gritty and realistic depiction of D&D that I could possibly imagine. Like this very silly, but also very like, no, this is exactly how adventurers act, and therefore this is how they should be treated. Because we all know adventurers who do stuff like this and who are sarcastic and cutting and not always working together in the most smart, it's just a really good adaptation of the trope of that D&D party, that goofy group, into another media form. I've rarely seen it done that well before.
Oh, absolutely. It's like if the Rat Queens were a metal or a rock and roll band in the 70s or 80s.
Mm-hmm.
Like they don't get the respect. They're going to the hotel, they're trashing it, they're doing the drugs, they're drinking,
Yes. Yeah, it really is a rock band. Yeah, absolutely.
And it's just like they're in the fantasy setting. They are a group of people that are hired to do, the jobs that other people don't want to do or other groups are not paid to do. And
and then yeah, absolutely.
Go ahead.
And them being like an all-female adventuring party, but then interacting with the other groups of adventuring parties out there. I could have, read a whole series just focused very seriously, not comedically, on that kind of dynamic. The idea of we're a hired adventuring party, but there's 5 other local adventuring parties here. Like almost like a taking a West Marches D&D campaign where it's multiple groups running around a single world, but then turning it into a comic. Even if they hadn't made it so funny, I still would be like, what an idea. What an idea to be like, we're an adventuring party, but we're not really, it's not about the ogre who lives in the woods that we got to go defeat. It's about the politics between all of these weird ragtag groups that are essentially, very oddball mercenary bands is one way to describe them, I guess. But the politics of adventuring is something that I had never really seen done so well or so hilariously.
Right, because you have them going to the mayor, and the mayor's like, "Oh, well, here's the job that we're going to give to you," and they're like, "Are you really? Why are you giving us this job?"
Right. They're literally doing the D&D character thing of saying to the mayor's face, fuck it, we think we'll just party tonight instead. And he's like, "But what? Okay, I guess you're adventurers. I guess I can't do anything about it." That's such a D&D thing. I love it.
Now, who's your favorite of the Rat Queens? I gotta know.
That is really, really tough. And I have to admit, so I hadn't said, but I've only read up to just maybe past volume 1. I need to get big time caught up on my Rat Queens because I was working on my dissertation for so long. I had to step away from comics. But I'm rusty on all the names is really the point that I'm getting to. But the Halfling Rogue is definitely my favorite. I gotta say that. And sorry, I'm blanking on her name. I was hoping maybe you were going to supply it.
Yes, I am going to supply it because she is my favorite character.
Really? I'm so glad to hear that.
That is Betty.
Betty, right, of course. How could I forget? Okay, so yeah, Betty from probably the first issue won my heart. Just the idea of going off into the woods, eating some magic mushrooms, and then being totally not willing to answer to the consequences of those actions. That is so funny to me to see a D&D adventurer take irresponsibility to new heights like that in a perfectly D&D way, in a perfect kind of the motif of fuck it, I drank the potion, what happens? Let me see what happens. It's okay, you're really willing to gamble with all of this. Great characterization, great playing the tropes of the D&D roles.
Yeah, she I already love halflings as far as D&D races go. They're my favorite, but seeing her in action just it's it's the thing where people, and again, we'll be talking D&D and everything else,
sure.
But it's you see those races and you're like, whatever. I want to play the big bad,
right.
The guy who's swinging the giant sword, the guy who's the tank or the meat shield, and it's I love when they have that representation of characters that are you just don't expect it from them, and then all of a sudden they're just in your face, sticking daggers in your head.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the same time, they've got their bag of goodies, and it's like, well, I don't know which one's candy and which one's the drugs, but I guess I'll pick one.
Right, right. It's a very I suppose chaotic neutral approach. I feel like chaotic neutral very rarely gets represented so well. Very often it's like really crazy. It's like sometimes it's just really silly, most like sometimes. But I do love how Betty carries herself throughout the series. It is really really good. Yeah.
Yeah, she's a lot of fun, and I've read more. I've read the 3 volumes that are out, and I know that they're releasing a 4th one right now. As you know, every month I believe a new issue comes out for the 4th volume. But yeah, what is it about Rat Queens beyond like the tie to the D&D thing? Like, what was it when it was coming out that you gravitated towards it?
I'll say this, I immediately gravitated towards the idea of an all-female adventuring party that was defined by their characters and like really defined by these strong interactions and relationships that they had with each other, and by the politics that they have with like the other adventuring parties, the 4 Daves, like all of that going on. I thought that they nailed the adventuring party dynamic and then made it interesting by making them all like it was like they had it felt like the Rat Queens themselves as characters had made a conscious choice to be like, it's gonna be the 4 of us and we're a team that trusts each other. And I really like when fantasy is willing to take, in particular when RPGs like D&D are willing to totally just disregard, because it's something I think I don't see very often. It's more often that somebody will say like, well, in medieval times, this woman would have just been dragged off and like thrown in prison and like because she's a witch, and it's like that's a very realistic straight way to Game of Thrones maybe way to play it. But I love when D&D kind of takes the opportunity to say, okay, no, in the world of Eberron, if you attack a goblin in the streets, that goblin's going to pull out papers and say, excuse you, I'm a citizen here, I pay taxes, I'm going to go call the town guard on you. And then you're looking at a goblin and the police are mad at you and you don't know what, but he's a goblin, like what did I do wrong? And like I love when the tropes are thrown to the wind, and D&D seems like a ripe opportunity to play with fantasy and just willy-nilly insert whatever modern sensibilities you feel like throwing in. So like just kind of mentioning something from my D&D games, I tend to not do accents. I tend to have my characters talk in a very modern way, because in my head it's really important just to communicate how this comes across to you if you lived in the time, but also because I'm not that married to the idea that there's a lot of doths and thous and forthwiths and such in the vocabulary of these fantasy worlds. I think they can sound like whatever we want. It's kind of like the idea of I think like Black Panther, like the idea of, okay, a magical, like super techno country in the middle of Africa. Well, that's kind of unlikely, but it's not more or less unlikely than any of their shit you see in Marvel Comics. So it's like, if you're already stretching things to their limit, why not play with something that you're really excited to play with? And I didn't realize how excited I was to see an spunky, well characterized all-female adventuring party that then in turn breaks the mold of the stereotypical heroes in a really fun, funny, and entertaining way. And that's what really drew me to them.
Yeah, it's just an amazing comic book series, and if you're not reading it, it's super easy to get into.
It's so easy to get into. Yes, yeah.
And again, I just want to say, like, it's going to catch you off guard with just how over the top it is, but once you understand that and settle into it, then you'll be good.
You just
ahead.
reminded me of like the riffing they do against each other and how over the top like some of the comments they make at each other's expense, and like the elbowing and jabs, like they are in some ways the archetypal D&D party, and then in other ways they break all these tropes so well, and it's just a delight. Yeah.
And I do have to say that you gave me a lot of love just in a moment ago when you mentioned Eberron, because that is my favorite D&D setting.
So I have only a single tattoo, but it is an Eberron least I should say, dragon mark. And so I would say of all the D&D worlds, Eberron is the one closest to my heart because it's the one that, like kind of like I just said with Rat Queens, it's the one that's willing to take fantasy and just say, yeah, but if we can do anything, then we're gonna have magic robots. Then that's what we're gonna have. If we have anything, then we're gonna have airships, and we're gonna have like things will be consistent within the world, but we're also like not gonna worry too much about how this works behind the scenes in terms of how is the magic power, is it work like technology. So it's a setting that is willing to really meet D&D where it is, as opposed to dragging D&D back to where Middle Earth is. That's how I'll kind of phrase it. I love when D&D harkens back to the classics in a great way, but that's usually not my favorite thing about RPGs. My favorite thing about RPGs is when somebody says, well, what if it was like D&D, but we insert all these other things from like Star Wars and all these other things that we really like, and make it consistent, make it plausible, don't break the consistency too wide open. Whatever your players can buy into, though, you can throw into the world, and it's your world, and no one can tell you, oh, actually that doesn't make any sense, I don't like your interpretation of it. So I mean, of course they can, but the idea is we're all, whatever your players buy into, that's all the permission that you need in terms of making something quote unquote canonical and consistent in your world.
Oh, definitely. Now, we touched on fantasy a little bit, and you're a big fan of a lot of the, typical fantasy stuff, Lord of the Rings, Game of Thrones, Narnia. There's one that caught me off guard because I have only seen the miniseries on it, and that was Dinotopia.
Dinotopia. Oh, I'm sorry. You saw the miniseries. That's kind of a bummer. So there were 2 series, I think, that came out for Dinotopia, unless I'm thinking of Dune, which would be reasonable because it's got a similar history, I think. So Dinotopia, I want to say, had 2 miniseries. It definitely had at least one. They were not good by my stand. I mean, I saw them at a very young age, and I remember my dad being like, this is amazing, dinosaurs. And my dad was like, it's actually not good, and you're going to realize this someday. And basically, like, I watched the series, but I grew up on the books and the picture books, because I didn't know this until recently, but basically Dinotopia was started by a guy's artwork, not his story idea first. He would like the idea of drawing these beautiful landscapes and then inserting dinosaurs into them just to create this kind of like effect, like what would dinosaurs look like in Greco-Roman times almost. And then he created the world of Dinotopia in order to create this setting for his art of, okay, in this perfect, beautiful, semi-medieval fantasy utopia, dinosaurs and humans coexist, and somehow that makes everything wonderful, and like it's this beautiful, perfect society of happy dinosaurs and people. It's one of these settings that is definitely closest to my heart, I would have to say.
Now, did you start off with fantasy at like a young age? And if so, what was your first one that like pulled you in?
Oh, that's really, really tough. It's been a long time probably since I've thought about that. I can definitely point at an odd direction. Well, not that odd, but considering like I'm trying to think of fantasy things, but I definitely remember Animorphs as a kid being something I was really, really into, and that was kind of sci-fi, fantastic elements to it. And I was growing up on a lot of that stuff. I would have to say more so than maybe even I was definitely reading a lot of fantasy, but it's all jumbled. And I was really reading Lord of the Rings and Narnia and all of those series at a very, very young age. So that's probably some of the first stuff that I grew up on. Magic cards were definitely hugely influential to what I would call my fantasy quote unquote vocabulary growing up. And I would say just as influential as any book were magic cards. And then by age 12 or 13, that's when I had discovered D&D and started realizing, I can make my own stories. I can do whatever I want. And that was also the age where I would go to the library and just kind of pick up fantasy and refuse to read anything else. else. And that was how I started realizing that there is good fantasy and there is also a lot of bad fantasy out there. When you go to your local public library and just say nothing else, just the fantasy section, but you've already read like Lord of the Rings and Narnia and you're looking for other stuff, you'll find some real crap out there. Like unless you have someone there to tell you like what's good and what's not. I remember reading some real bad fantasy books growing up, and to be fair, I remember in my teens in high school finally getting around to reading some of the D&D novels by like R.A. Salvatore, and I really loved reading those because the way that they were told, I could see how they were taken from the ideas of an RPG and turned into a story, and it was a really cool way for me to almost I would never want R.A. Salvatore to think that I actually still hold this opinion, but I remember reading them in high school and being like, I could do this, like I could do what he's doing here right now, and I was like very inspired to become a storyteller in a weird way, not just by the great classics that I love so much, but by these very down-to-earth writers like R.A. Salvatore who were participating within this game that, you know, I felt just, you know, I play D&D, I know everything R.A. Salvatore does probably, and like he took these stories and turned them into novels, and I felt very inspired. I was like, I could do that someday. I could be like R.A. Salvatore and take my stories and turn them into novels. And it wasn't until years and years later when I was trying to write novels that I realized I was teaching and writing novels, and I loved teaching and interacting with people in person more than I loved novel writing. And that was the only reason that I started moving away from wanting to be a fantasy author like those heroes I had, and moving towards being something different, a different kind of storyteller, something that I argue is much more like a teacher than it is like an author. I think a game master in some weird ways is wrong to think of as an author because they don't have all the time and resources. They got to perform on the spot, and it's like charisma based, and it's you got to be ready to tell that story in much the same way I would argue a teacher or an actor or any kind of performer is kind of asked to participate.
That is awesome, because you laid down some books that, number one, like I just started reading Animorphs last year.
Oh, really? Wow. That is really impressive, actually. I'm wondering what you're thinking of it now.
Well, I don't know. Like at that point, I was reading, you know, Lord of the Rings, and I had started with The Hobbit at probably like 11 or 12, and Lord of the Rings after that.
Now that you mentioned The Hobbit, I probably have to give Hobbit credit as being my technical first. It's very unoriginal, but yeah, it's very much the truth. The Hobbit was probably my introduction, but definitely, yeah.
Yeah, most of my like high school years were like Star Wars books, and then like my mom had one of those, you know, those kiosks in the mall, and you sell like the little knick-knacky stuff.
Yes,
yeah. So my parents had that, and on the weekends I'd come in and go to Walden Books or B. Dalton, camp out at the fantasy section. That's where I first got my first D&D book, second edition, were from there.
That's awesome. That's really cool. I feel like I can definitely attest to similar experiences. Like being left in a bookstore was definitely my best and favorite way to experience like shopping with my parents or something like that. They would leave us in the bookstore section, fantasy section. Usually it was back when Books and Borders would have like the D&D section right next to the fantasy section, so I could check out which source books had cool covers and like which ones, you know, what monsters were in each of them, and then I would know what I wanted to like ask for Christmas later on. So absolutely, I loved getting left in those situations.
Oh yeah, my first book was the complete book of elves, I believe, because I love the artwork on the inside.
Oh my gosh. Okay, I'm trying to remember now because I definitely had like, I feel like that's a thing with young people interested in fantasy, and I have to speculate on this now that you mention it, because I was all about little encyclopedia books like that. We had a lot of dinosaur encyclopedias when I was growing up, but then a lot of like, okay, dragons and other things that never were. Books that were like, okay, here, let's detail all these mythological monsters one by one in alphabetical order, and I guess bestiaries, like child bestiaries were my number one favorite kind of book. And you mentioning the idea of like, oh, the complete book of elves or something like that. I wonder what the overlap is between people interested in RPGs, which are, to my mind, and what I argue in my dissertation, basically the idea of learning encapsulated, because you're given a system that's much bigger than you could ever know. No one can know everything that is in the world of D&D. It is impossible because there's always some weird fact out there that you don't know yet. And so it's this idea of learning crystallized, where literally you're presented with too much information and you need to figure out critically how to work your way through all that information and synthesize it. So I wonder what the overlap is between RPGs and these kind of encyclopedia, almost like textbooks for kids, if you will. Even if they're about fictional things, it's still a textbook in a weird way. And why do people like us love those so much? I don't know if I have the answer to that, but I think it has to do with how we love to learn, probably.
Absolutely. And I know you'd mentioned Animorphs, and I said I was reading it. I've read probably I don't know, like 25, 30 of them. I've been working my way through because it's not hard reading. I can finish a book in generally a couple days. But it's a lot of fun. I really like the way that they do the powers. But there are some not great books that are out there that you're like, oh gosh, why am I reading this one? It's so terrible.
I remember that was a big eye-opening moment for me at that age, being like, but I didn't enjoy that book. Like, that, how does that work? I don't understand. Where's the other end that I like? Like, where's the good part? I'm like shaking the book, wondering where the missing pages are. Because I think when you're a kid, I think you're exposed mostly, I mean, obviously to things that you can read at first, but then once you can read a lot of things, people try to give you the best stuff, and there's so much forgettable fantasy out there, and people, no pun intended, but people forget that, and then you put a kid in a public library in the fantasy section where people have, donated books that they don't necessarily want anymore. I was more than likely going to find some real not winners out there, unfortunately.
Yeah, what blew me away was when my friends started telling me to read it. Like, I started reading, I was like, oh, some of these books aren't the best. And then they sprung on me that, oh, the author is not like, that's her name on the books, but not all of those books are written by her.
Oh, interesting. I did not know when she stopped writing the... Oh, interesting. Okay, cool. I remember, yeah.
Yeah, it's so crazy.
I'll also say I always felt like the Andalite Chronicles and the Hork-Bajir Chronicles were the superior books because they were more like novels and less like little novellas, if you will. And I felt like because they focus on the aliens and not on the human stories, they were much more up my alley as a kid. So if you're at all curious and you've been enjoying your Animorph experience so far, I cannot recommend the Andalite Chronicles and the Hork-Bajir Chronicles enough. It's kind of like the story of how both of those races became involved in these stories to a degree, and a good origin story, let alone an origin story about aliens, is like my meat and potatoes right there. I love it.
And going now, so we've talked fantasy and rat queens and everything, but the thing that's front and center is tabletop gaming.
Of course, yes.
So did you transition the way I did, as far as like in the library or in the bookstore? You're at the fantasy section, right next to it is the role playing section, and then that's like your entry point?
So it's interesting because my library didn't have any D&D or probably even really any D&D related books, maybe one D&D novel at the most. And so I never experienced the D&D books first. What happened was sometime around age 11, 12, or 13, I went online, and this was in the fairly early days of the internet, but not too hard to like go around, find some PDF documents about something called D&D that was being sold at the time from TSR to Wizards of the Coast. I think that was probably how I heard about it, was the sales were going on, and I would go to Wizards of the Coast's websites to learn about like Magic and Pokemon cards and stuff. stuff. And so I was aware that they were getting involved with D&D, and I was like, D&D, what is this? And I found a second edition adventure, a quick start adventure, where basically I distinctly remember one phrase written in there. It was saying, okay, so there are 3 rats in the bottom of the tower. If you are playing in this little one shot, we're essentially DMing you in this little adventure. If you are playing as the fighter, the rats need to get a 17 to hit you. But if you're playing as the Thaddeus the wizard, then they only need a 14 to hit you. And I said, oh, so it depends on who you're playing as. So really, you could be playing as anybody, and you don't have to be fighting rats. You could be fighting anything, and that means you don't have to be in this tower. You could be anywhere. You could do, and I started like hyperventilating. I'm like, you can do anything with this. You can take this system here, but then apply it to any other circumstance, fantasy, not fantasy, anything you wanted. And once that kind of click got made, and I say that the closest thing to it for the modern kid is like that moment in Minecraft, I think, where they're like, so what, I gather a bunch of sticks, and then I guess I can build something, and then I can do anything. I can do anything in this. And like that moment of awakening where it clicks and you realize the freedom that this tool has given you, the power that's in your hands to construct the kind of story that you want. I was blown away by the potential inherent to such a system. And I printed out the adventure. I went to my brother and I said, would you run this with me? Like, would you help me to do this, because I can't do it by myself? And then we proceeded to go to my younger sister and say, we need you to sit at a table for like just a few minutes. And she's like, why? It's like, well, we're gonna play a game, and we just need you to be part of the game just for like a little bit. And we totally just kept like tricking our sisters into playing with us with like weird promises. Oh, you get to play like the sneaky hobbit, like you want to do that, right? And like, no, they didn't. Like, so that was how my first experience started, was me and my brother desperately trying to get my sisters to play, and having mixed results. I'll say that over the years, getting them to play. And so there are a few factors in there that I find interesting, which is I did not discover D&D in a social way. I discovered it online, spread it through my siblings with mixed results, let alone friends and stuff. And really, I got into the hobby mostly in isolation, which is not how most people get into it. To be fair, most people get into it through friends, but then the real answer to that is most people don't get into D&D. Most people who would get into D&D don't get into it at all because they don't have the friends, and it's very unusual for people to get into D&D in isolation the way that I did. So my earliest experiences with D&D were defined by me thinking, I love this game. I think about it literally every day in school. I'm so excited to play it, but I've played it maybe 3 times, all said and done, only with my brothers and sisters, and I'm just sure at this age that no one else in the world plays this game but me. Like, I could go to a comic book shop, but no, I'm never going to actually find other people who will play this game with me. That just hadn't occurred to me. And I still didn't know, like, a lot of my friends would take their magic cards to the comic book shop and, card shop and like play and stuff. I didn't know people were doing this. And I was the kind of kid who preferred to just kind of be hanging out on the computer by myself. I was very introverted. So for the most part, I think of my experience with D&D as being hugely influential to my business model, because my business model is based around the idea of seeking out the people who want to play but don't feel like they have an avenue in. And it bugs me when people online are like, well, they should just know. They should just know they should go to a comic book shop. I'm like, it's not that easy. And the fact of the matter is, no one's out there sweating because they can't play D&D because they don't have a friend. No one's freaking out over this. Most people are like, I guess I'll never play it. Oh well. And if you really want to grow the hobby, then you gotta find those people and you gotta bring them in. And I'm not saying that people want to grow the hobby, but I personally am all about growing the hobby, and that's the service that I provide, is bringing people into the hobby who would not get to be in that hobby otherwise. And I think that a lot of that was conceptualized by me being somebody who's like, gosh, I want to run more D&D. I was somebody who didn't get to DM enough, and I would hear about people like, either I don't want to DM, or much more often they didn't feel confident, or they felt like, it was just not the right time or place or situation for them to DM. And I was just like, I want to DM so badly, and getting my friends together was tough just because it was like kind of obvious. People just want to hang out, and something I say about DMing is, or GMing is, it's like telling your friends, we could hang out and have dinner and a few drinks, or you could all listen to me dominate this conversation, and you'll have a lot more fun that way, I promise. Like, that's the most bold declaration you could make to your group of friends, is listen to me instead of just talking like normal people, and I promise you'll have more fun doing some silly story this way. And so I think a lot of my friends are very into RPGs, but then I would get so worked up about it and being like very professional about it that it made it difficult for me to enjoy it, because they wanted a casual fun experience. And so I realized, like, in a weird way, I wasn't getting satisfied by the amount of D&D that I wanted to play and run, and there are people out there who are looking for people like me. So the question is, I could go out there and try to run games for a bunch of strangers, but that wasn't that appealing, and knowing that that would stop me from running the games for my friends and my brother and my siblings and stuff, I didn't like that. I didn't like the idea that my solution was going to be to just seek out players, which there's nothing wrong with that, but that felt weird to me, the idea that I would just get my fix by going out there and trying to hunt people down when I had lots of people who wanted to play with me. And once I kind of thought about the supply and demand elements of it, I realized like, there's another important thing about professional DMing. The best professional GM out there is not me. The best GM out there is probably not even GMing for free. The best GM out there is probably raising his kids and doing a job, because most GMs do not have time to do the craft that they want. And I realized this, and realized, like, there needs to be a kind of shift, because if we want people who can go out there and run lots and lots of games for people and bring people into this hobby, then that needs to be their full-time gig. We need to be able to subsidize that somehow for those people, to bring those people into the hobby. And then it's just a matter of me feeling like I am a person who could do that. And why me and not why somebody else? I asked that question too. I wish more people would kind of step up and be like, no, I'm good at this, and I'm going to go out there and bring more people into the hobby with the skills that I can provide and show off to them. I think certainly in New York, I bring in more people every day, and there could easily be other people doing what I'm doing out there. That's my 2 cents on the issue.
Oh, absolutely. Now, as far as tabletop gaming goes, as for Dungeons and Dragons specifically, was your first foray into it, like I know you talked about the PDF of like the second edition, or the second edition revised and whatnot, but were you like one of those early adopters of third edition, or?
Very funny story, actually. For my birthday, the year that third edition came out, I asked for all 3 of the second edition, revised edition AD&D books. And then a month after my birthday, literally my birthday's April, it was that summer, third edition dropped. And that's all anybody was talking about, and that's all anybody cared about. And I looked it over, and I declared to my brother, third edition is crap. I hate it. It's stupid. I will never play third edition. Within 2 weeks, I had done more research on third edition, and I loved everything about it. I had learned all the rules of AD&D. It still messes me up, because now I know 4 different editions of D&D at this point. So it really gets, and second edition in some ways has enough overlap with 5th edition where it will really throw me for a loop sometimes. But the point is, AD&D, I learned it all, and then when I learned third edition, I was like, oh my god, this is better in every way, shape, and form. It sucks so much. I was a grognard for exactly 2 weeks weeks, and then I retired from being a grognard after that. I was just like 3rd edition all the way. I'm converting everything to 3rd edition. It's so much better. The math is so much simpler. Like everything's easier in this, and I loved 3rd edition. And to this day, 3rd edition. I will say 3.5 and even Pathfinder more specifically. All those have a very, very close place in my heart. Even having run years of 5th edition now, I probably have the most experience. I can't say that. I definitely have the most experience with 5th edition now for sheer volume of games that I'm running. But 3rd edition was the one probably I've spent the most years playing. Because I started it 2 weeks in, pretty much to 3rd edition dropping, and then played it right up until the point of, I still am running a Pathfinder game on Saturdays for some of my students right now. So I kind of never stopped playing 3rd edition, as it were.
Yeah, I remember we were playing 2nd edition probably in college, my 3rd year. And then all of a sudden it's like, okay, here's the instructions on how to convert your character to 3rd edition D&D. I was like, oh, well, this makes it a lot easier, because I was one of those people, even at whatever age I was, like 19 or so, where I'm like, I have no clue what number I need to roll to hit I'm going to roll the dice, and you tell me if I hit.
You tell me if I did it. Absolutely. Yeah. More often than not. I mean, that's a great place to start. Honestly, that's part of the reason why I like that I can come in with the knowledge of the rules, because to me, how do you learn D&D? Well, you don't sit down with a rule book. I'll tell you that right now. That's one of the worst ways you could try to teach yourself D&D. It's not the worst way, but it's definitely far from the best way. One of the best ways is to sit down with somebody who knows the game and just follow their lead. I tell people you need to know nothing about D&D before you sit down with me, and I'm not going to tell you a rule, not even one, until we're actually rolling the dice, and I start with the story, and then immediately say, okay, so here's the thing, I just mentioned this area, so does anyone want to make a history check to see what else you might know about this area? Or does anyone want to make a perception check now that I've described the scene to see what else you might see around here? Well, how do we do that? Here is a D20, and that's the first time I've even mentioned the dice. So I think the right way, and it's tricky because that is the right way to go about a board game. That's a huge thing with board games, is you explain everything beforehand, and I fully acknowledge that is the right way to do it. If you tried that with D&D, no one would have ever played a game of D&D once in their lives. It's impossible to describe every rule of D&D. It's also, I don't consider it really possible to even describe the essentials before the game has started, not if you're playing with a totally new player, because you'll be saying like, well, sometimes you'll run into this kind of monster, and sometimes you'll run into this kind of monster, and they'll be like, where and when and what are you even talking about? Like looking around there. And I think a lot of like long-term D&D players forget just how weird it is to someone who hasn't seen the game before. And I say the biggest difference isn't whether you've played it or not. It's whether you've even just seen people play. I teach many people who have never seen a game of D&D before and will ask me, do I need to talk in a voice? Do we need to wear costumes? And I have to like explain very fundamental things like that. Like, no, you don't. You absolutely, this is for you to decide how committed you want to get into this. Like, this is totally fine, whatever you want to do. So, it's very, very interesting to see the kind of approach that different people take to the game. But I'm very big on learning as you play.
Now, do you have in the D&D setting or the the typical fantasy setting, do you have like a favorite race or a favorite class that you just love to play?
Ooh, oh man, right now I've got a soft spot for tieflings because I can't figure it out exactly, but a lot of like my younger, newer to the game female players really like playing tieflings, and I've been trying to scratch my head figuring out what it is about tieflings. It's some overlap with anime, and I can't quite puzzle it out. It's a fun little riddle for me to try to like figure out, but I've been very much enjoying having tieflings in my campaigns lately. In terms of what I like to play, I'm strongly biased towards dwarves. I love playing dwarves because dwarves to me are iconic and have strong characterization without dominating a party. If you're playing the bard, you're playing like a very archetypal bard, part of doing that is almost like talking over everybody and making sure you're the one like making snappy jokes all the time, and like that is a great way to role play, but it's also unfortunate that sometimes if you're role playing that well, people will get annoyed through you're just doing a good job role playing, but at the same time in the game sitting around with adults, they'll be like, ugh, are you could I get a word in edgewise or something? Just one example. But whereas with a dwarf, I just sit in the background, grunt the occasional comment, and yet I still have a strong presence because you can picture the dwarf sitting there in the back of the group, kind of scratching his head, a little bit of comic relief, kind of being a goofball and just like hanging out. He's just there. We just know he's there because every time you picture the group, the dwarf is easy to picture. And that's what I like about dwarves is you can play an offbeat. I played a dwarven wizard and made him very, very unusual, like an eccentric kind of like Odin type character with a raven on his shoulder, very like old, wise and man. I've played a dwarven ranger who is like basically Batman hunting people down. I played dwarven clerics, and that's more stereotypical, like I'm the dwarf who is backing you up right here. So I love to play all different kinds of dwarves because of how it allows me to be a part of the party while mostly not spectating, but taking more of a backseat role in the party, if that makes sense. I feel like when I'm playing, I don't want to dominate because I know that my DM instinct will tell me, there's a lull. Okay, I got to keep things moving. Let me say something that my character does or says. And very often with a DM, I might distract them with that and like make the next half hour of the adventure about some weird interaction that I'm creating with the GM, while the other players are like, I guess we're just here in this game watching Tim and his brother interact. And it's like, I never want to be doing that. So.
Now, we were talking before we started recording, and one of the things that we were talking about is that there is much more out there beyond, Dungeons and Dragons.
Yes, absolutely.
What are some of your favorite other systems that you love to play?
People are always shocked when they hear that D&D is not my favorite system, and that in fact fantasy is not my favorite genre of role-playing games, because I love D&D to the death. It has a very warm place in my heart. I run it. 95% of my games are D&D, and the reality is that I think it is a great way to get into RPGs. Not necessarily the best way, but it is one of the best ways, if only because everyone knows the name and most people have a cultural association enough to know what they're getting into, which is not the case with most other RPGs by far. My favorite RPG to run is Call of Cthulhu. I love Call of Cthulhu. I think mystery horror games are some of my favorite RPGs, and it's interesting because I consider them easily twice as difficult to DM as D&D. Easily, without a doubt, it is much, much harder to run a mystery than it is to run a D&D combat or exploration or something like that, because you can screw up a mystery. You can mess that up real bad. You have to cover your tracks. You have to put out information, but only in the most limited way. You need to know how to spool information out piece by piece. Like, it is essential that you be able to do things like, oh, you asked this? Well, here's what this is. Oh, you asked that? Well, then I'm going to give you a little bit of extra information that really you would have thought in a D&D game would have been included in that first question. It's like, give me all the answers. But no, in Call of Cthulhu, I'm withholding as much as I possibly, not as much as I can, like I'm being antagonistic, but there's an accepted fact that because it's a mystery, they have to really work overtime to get me to spill the information. Because ultimately, the information is what is valuable, not whether you get a dice roll and an attack roll, because in Call of Cthulhu, you can shoot the monster and it's a 50-50 shot whether bullets even hit this thing or whether they just bounce off or pass through it, or like, so it's not so much in Call of Cthulhu do I have this advantage in combat, it's do I have the information I need to know where I should go and where I should not go. It's the difference between going left is, a safe route, and going right is inevitable death, no saving throw, no nothing. So like Like, when those are your choices, and it's not a matter of, well, if you're good at Constitution, you can go this way, but if you're good at Wisdom, you got to go this way. Like, it's much more of a, if you didn't learn the information for this mystery, then you're dead in the water if you make the wrong decision here. And what I find is my instinct is, oh no, people prefer D&D because they like to have that power and they like to have that control. They like to be able to say, oh, a dragon? Well, that's bad, but at the same time, I've got a bow. So I know I have some agency here. Maybe I can't win this, but I'm not dead in the water, as it were. I'm not helpless. Whereas in a horror game, my instinct at first is like, oh, people aren't going to like that. They want to have a little bit of agency. It is a role-playing game. The whole point is, what are their choices and what do they do? Not, what story am I just yelling at them? So at the same time, I find that players very often rise to the occasion of a horror mystery game and say, like, no, I don't open that door. Whereas in D&D, very few people are going to be like, they'll say, I don't open the door until my party arrives and we're all ready. But it's not like they're going to say, you know what? I don't want any treasure, actually. I'm going to leave this house. Like, whereas in Call of Cthulhu, that I tell players, like, that's sometimes the only winning move, is to just say, we go home and go about with our lives and stuff. So, like, I love Call of Cthulhu because it creates so much tension. I see people constantly in my Call of Cthulhu games get actually anxious and tense, and that is so rewarding to see, because in my D&D games I veer in a strong other direction. Even if a dragon shows up and their lives are on the line, it's generally still pretty funny. There's still comedy going on, and to be fair, in Call of Cthulhu it is still comic, but at the same time they're like, but you said we heard something in this room. I'm like, yep, and you open the door and nothing's there. And they're like, but oh man, like this. So do we go in the room or do we not? Because this is strongly feeling like, okay, it's supposed to lure us into a false sense. So, and it's like, it actually becomes less like what is Tim expecting and more like, okay, this is so stereotypically horror genre, like tap, tap, tap on the window. You look at the window, nothing's there. It's so stereotypical that they're almost like not playing me anymore. And they're just saying, okay, if I was writing this damn horror movie and I'm crapping my pants now, what would I expect the players to do? And that's going to be the thing that makes the monster show up probably, or maybe that's a red herring. And like, they go crazy in Call of Cthulhu games, and that's really what I love, is to get that kind of a reaction out of things. And then they also know that when a monster shows up, I am being 100% merciless, because very often Call of Cthulhu games are like a one shot, so people can die. It's still fun anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember making my first Call of Cthulhu character back in high school, and it was like, okay, just be aware that you're probably going to rip up that character sheet before the night is over.
The first time I ran a Call of Cthulhu game, I remember my brother not being a huge fan of it, because he's like, but I made a whole story for this character. I'm like, yeah, and he might die in this random house. And he's like, but that kind of sucks. I want to see where his story goes. But then in that same adventure, I inserted a rat thing, which is a Lovecraft. Well, the adventure actually had a rat thing in it, but it is a very creepy Lovecraftian monster that is basically a rat, a giant rat with a human face at the end of its head, creepily enough. And they met one of those things, and my friend to this day still is like, I have a immense fear of like anything like mentioning the rat thing or anything like that. And that was it. It was supposed to be Brown Jenkins, a relative of Black Jenkins, who I think is a character from an H.P. Lovecraft story. And so every now and then I'll mention my friend Brown Jenkins, and he's like, no, not Brown Jenkins. The rat thing looked up, stared at him with its human face, and then cast a spell at him and blasted him and caused his whole arm to like wither away. And like, it was, I've never had a moment like that in a D&D game where someone has come up to me afterwards and been like, I still think about how scary that was. So yeah.
Yeah, it's incredible, the amount and style and just so much. There's, I think what we grew up on with, here's the books that are available in the comic shop or in the gaming shop.
Yeah.
And now we live in this world where not only do we have that, but we have all these just resources online, all these different games that are available. And it's just, you can take your pick of Okay, what do we want to play today? You want to play sci-fi? Well, you got like 100 different
Yeah,
choices.
100
You want to
different,
play horror?
exactly.
You want to play something based on a comic book that you love, or you want to play in a comic book world? Well, here's all these different settings. Like, it's
Mhm.
so incredible the amount of just choice and variety that's out there.
It's why I kind of tell people, like, there's so many different avenues I've thought of taking my business, and one of them is, of course, the idea of me designing my own RPG. And I love the idea of doing that. I might do that someday, but it's the idea of there are so many RPGs out there, from Wizards of the Coast down to what I love to call mom and pop RPGs, where I've literally met, like, at a convention, I met a couple who was like, basically, like, it was a family, and like a dad and his sons would play test the dad's RPG with him. They had a booth at PAX Unplugged, and it was just so cool. In fact, I because I have it right here nearby, I want to mention the name, if I can, of the Beyonder. Beyonder was the name of this, like, nice little indie RPG. My friend went and play tested it. He got back to me, and I was like, dude, you're my eyes and ears. I didn't have time. How was it? And he gave me all this great feedback, because he was pretty savvy about what the game was kind of doing and what its pros and, like, what it kind of advantages it had over other RPGs. And you're right, it's just so much variety out there that I could make an RPG and get lost in a sea of other people making RPGs. I would much rather find something like Numenera, for example. Numenera's got a lot of attention, but outside of the RPG community, no one's going to know what Numenera is. If I go to somebody who hasn't played D&D and ask them if they know what Numenera is, there is a 0% chance they're going to give me the answer of, oh, Numenera, Monty Cook, it's a cool world, here's what it does. And I have been dying to run Numenera. I have not gotten to. I've done a ton of research on it, but the reality is nobody comes to me asking to run Numenera. I would love to sit down and say, hey, Monty Cook, let's talk, because I run D&D, but I would love to bring more attention to your game. I could design an RPG, but I'd rather give the attention that could go to my RPG to other people's RPGs, and then be a professional running Numenera for people who can't find. And that, to me, is something that I don't get to do enough, is the idea of going to the actual fans. And they might have very specific D&D games they want me to do, and at the end of the day, I want to go to them and be like, listen, I can run a very specific D&D game for you. Or, who has ever gotten to play Paranoia? Who has ever gotten to play Dread, the RPG where you use Jenga blocks to figure out who dies in a kind of slasher horror movie type thing? Like, these RPGs are out there. I'm dying to run them. And the reality is, because I know I can run these games, and I know there's a lot of demand out there, I'm looking to be doing those professionally. And I would love to even be interacting with the people who make these games, doing their maybe video actual plays of their RPGs and stuff. And, like, I think my versatility is something that I want to bring to the table that very often in my professional work doesn't get called upon enough. I'm very often asked to come in and run D&D for a bunch of people who haven't played D&D before, and that's fairly easy to do, and I can go in and I know 100% I can provide that experience blindfolded. I'm very excited to kind of start branching out into some of the other opportunities out there, both for fun but also in a professional capacity, which to me strongly overlaps, to say the least. Obviously, like, the games that I love and want to run are the ones that I want to make part of my business, because they're the ones that people want to play. It's all part of the overlap of, if I'm enjoying these games, I mean, it's an inherent thing to my job, is the kind of anxiety of, well, if I'm having fun, are they mad at me because they're paying me? But the reality is, I tried a game once where I took it very, very seriously and, like, didn't joke and, like, laugh and, like, get, and it was weird. It was so weird. And I realized my customers absolutely want me to be kind of enjoying myself and having fun. That makes it more fun for them. So to my mind, if a group could, or any of the Warhammer 40,000 RPGs, Star Wars RPGs, any of these, getting out there and getting to run these, because these universes are so cool to me and I'm dying to tell stories in them. And the reality is, I know Death Watch, the Warhammer 40,000 game where you play the team of elite Space Marines going around. There are so few people out even in New York City running a Death Watch campaign right now. I could easily find a group and run that, and I would just love to be doing it in a professional, like, official capacity.
Now, you have the business. How did you got started with the business from just people coming and saying that they wanted to play, or how did that evolve?
So it was me working at Forbidden Planet first, and I had joined up at Forbidden Planet mainly because I wanted to start getting involved in the comic/gaming industry, like the kind of work. So as I mentioned, when I was younger, I really didn't go to comic book shops. I didn't socialize much with other nerdy people at these kind of locuses of nerd culture, as it were. So working at Forbidden Planet for a couple of years was very much an opportunity for me to kind of get my feet wet in that community. And also, I mean, part of it was me feeling anxious, like, what right do I have to be wanting to be in the RPG industry if I haven't done any work in it? I've been on my own for so long. I felt kind of like a poser, but in reality now I look back and it was more just the anxiety of I knew so much about D&D but didn't really socialize on the scale of D&D that much with other. I didn't know much about the community, even if I knew much about the game, is probably the best way to describe it. And once a day, no joke, for a year, I was meeting somebody because anytime, I would try to hang out in the RPG section and make sure that, if people had questions about it, that I would be there to answer it. So I was trying to get people to not ask me questions about comics and focus on asking me questions about RPGs. And of course, that's 99% not the questions that I'd be getting asked. So anytime someone asked me about D&D, I'd talk to them about it. I'd explain, what I knew about it and what, I could help them with in terms of getting started. But at the end of the day, every answer was the same of, I don't know who would run the game for me. I don't know if I would have my friends would play it. I don't know if I could run it for my friends. And it was always the same answer. And I was dying because I was like, no, that can't be the answer. I cannot see these people coming and going, all of whom would play D&D and would have fun with it because they're so peripheral to the hobby. They're into comics, they're into other board games. So why wouldn't they know they would play D&D, but they just don't see the opportunity there? That's when I printed up my business cards, and literally the first gig I ever got was a mom coming to me being like, looking at the beginner box and being like, you don't know anybody who like runs these professionally for birthday parties or something, do you? And I handed her my business card and she went, I've been looking for somebody like you for like weeks. And I had to laugh. I literally said, of course you were. But in my head, I'm like, what are the chances that this woman has been looking for weeks for a job that essentially I had just printed out my cards probably the week before? She's been thinking about this longer than, I had at that point, realistically, thinking of it in terms of this being an actual thing. I had spent a whole year thinking about it, and I spent close to a year of my life feeling like I was not good enough, that who the hell am I to be claiming that I can do this professionally and that I can go out and charge people. And now I look back and I realize how silly that is to think in terms of, because the reality is I know I'm not the best DM in the world. I'm just a DM who's willing to run games for strangers. That is the difference between me and your local friendly DM. And so very often when people have DMs, I tell them you don't really need me. I can provide a service, but very often my service is aimed at people who don't have access to a DM and are just looking for, a different experience. They're looking to just play D&D and they don't know any other way. I started handing out business cards at Forbidden Planet, and that is how I got involved. And I think my big message to people out there who like this and to people out there who are skeptical about this is the idea of, I know full well I am not anything special. I tell people, especially veteran gamers, I go to them and I say, what I'm going to provide for you is the D&D experience. I'm not going to provide, if you have your friendly local DM and you've got him like, him or her making all these amazing things, I might not be able to top that. Most likely, if they really have time on their hands and they're really dedicated to running that volunteer game for all of you, I'm not going to top that experience. I'm there to show up and run games for people people who want to be a part of this and don't really see any other way. And that's where I kind of tell people, listen, if you want to go out there and run games for these people, please do, because there's so many people who want this who aren't getting it right now. And I just happen to be actively seeking those people and bringing them towards me, using spaces to run these games and building. So I should say, after I finished up at Forbidden Planet, I moved on to a store that I would love to plug called the Brooklyn Strategist. The Brooklyn Strategist is a store that I worked at for maybe a little over 2 years, running the RPG department there, and they have a wonderful system where they bring in kids for an after-school program, and then in the evenings, the store, it's a board game cafe, and they have a retail section up front, but they have a whole gaming area, and they have a beautiful backyard, 2 separate different gaming areas, lots of war gamers come over there, but also they have a very thriving and active RPG environment that welcomes newcomers. And so I was kind of running a lot of the RPG events there, learning a lot about the logistics of how these large-scale events work, but also recognizing that this is not what I wanted to do, was organizing 12 different D&D tables. My expertise is not an organization. My expertise comes in the storytelling and actually running the games. So I always wanted to be running the games there, and I had opportunities to do that, but not quite as many as I was hoping for. The store itself does an amazing thing, which, as I was mentioning, the after-school programs, but then in the evenings, the adults would get to come in and essentially use the same space once it's cleared out to run and play their games. And we would have dates come over there. It's just a great place, and I love the board game cafes like that we do get to have in New York and in other cities that can kind of support them. I think they are wonderful environments, and I, especially the Brooklyn Strategist, I can't recommend it enough. But I was there for a few years before kind of breaking off to go and do this freelance and, working with groups of coworkers maybe who would ask me to come in. Something I'm running now more often than almost anything else is actually family games, which I love. And it's not just like, sometimes it'll be just the kids, but actually what I'm running more and more of is parents playing alongside like their teenage and college age kids, which to me are some of the most rewarding games that I get right now. It is so cool to see that, because someday I'm going to get my parents to play a D&D game with me, but I have no idea when that's going to be. So if I get to run a game and bring in a father and a daughter to play on the same team as each other, that to me is such a cool experience, especially when they have hilarious family antics between themselves where they'll be disagreeing, or a guy's son will be like, I'm going to go and open the door, and it'll be like, we talked about this, wait until the team shows up, maybe you're the wizard, and he's like, nope, I go and open the door, and literally I'm like, your teammate, and he's your dad, but it's also your teammate, and it's this weird way that the power dynamic kind of gets played with, because you are given that freedom, but then in a weird way you're held responsible. When your parent is also your teammate, in theory they're not going to say, I'll ground you if you open up the door to that dungeon, but on the other hand, you have to then experience your parent as a teammate where they're like, I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed because now my character died because you put my character in danger, and I loved my character. And it's like, wow, these are very powerful interactions. And that particular example did not happen. No son got father's character killed. That would be way too Star Wars, but at the same time, it was like just the family dynamics and then seeing how they play out when everyone's fantasy characters is really, really cool and rewarding.
That's awesome. Now, how do people go about getting in contact with you, or for like getting you to do their stuff, or follow you like on Facebook or Twitter? Like, what are your go-to sites?
Absolutely. I would say the easiest way to reach me is very simple, just emailing me. That's the thing I can check the most often, and it's where I go do most of my business through, and that is TIMM.Woods, so Tim with 2 M's, .woods at gmail.com. I am also on Twitter as TIMM Woods, or I should say at Timm Woods. And then also on Instagram, you can see a lot of like the shots of my games and like they kind of set up with like battles in progress and stuff. Most of my really cool miniatures were actually like created for me, like by some of my players, and so I'm very lucky in that respect. But you can see on my Instagram a lot of those photos, and that is just at Timm.Woods. Same Timm with 2 M's. Yeah.
Okay, and I imagine you stay close to like the Northeast area, like New York and that area.
Absolutely I used to run games as far north as Connecticut, but that became very unfeasible in terms of transportation and stuff. So because now I'm mostly running like 2 games a day. If I'm running a game on a day, I'm probably running 2 games and sometimes even running 3 games in a single day. So I generally am trying to double up on any one day, so travel time is limited, and I mostly operate out of Brooklyn, so I tend to work for a lot of families in Manhattan and in Brooklyn, and for schools that are in Manhattan, doing after school programs and stuff like that.
Awesome. So if anyone's interested, especially in that area, or any businesses or people that are making RPG games and you are interested in having someone run them, reach out to Timm.
I'm all about it, especially if you're interested in me popularizing an RPG of yours and want me to like jump in on a video actual play. Something I've like been talking about people doing is the idea of like people who want to get videos of people running their games. I can jump in and provide that GM experience. You put together a group of players, and then I'll create advertising content for people that way. And I like to think that what I'm bringing to the table is less of a game design aspect and more of that kind of I tell people all the time, GMing is not an intelligence or wisdom based skill, it's a charisma based skill, whether we like it or not. It is unfortunately all about how that performance, it's all about how you're like wrapping people up in the moment and stuff. And I like to think that I have a very teacher's kind of persona / character which shines through, which is I'm spending a lot of my time when I GM explaining the rules of what I'm doing as I do it simultaneously, and also just being very like excited and passionate. A number one thing that I'm bringing when I show up at a family game or something like that is a sense of excitement and a sense of who's ready to meet a dragon. Like a lot, that is so much of what actually does go into D&D that people don't always realize, and so that's ultimately what I'm trying to come in and provide. And so getting people excited about an RPG, that's what I always want to be doing.
Awesome. Well, Timm, thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule, and it was a blast to have you on.
It was absolutely a blast to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to Tales from the Fandom. Subscribe to us on iTunes or your podcast app of choice. Follow us on Facebook at www.facebook.com/talesfromthefandom to see photos, links, leave feedback, and check out upcoming guests. If you'd like to be a guest, email David at talesfromthefandom@gmail.com.